The morning fog clung to the Boston skyline as Grace Thompson rushed down the narrow cobblestone street, the heels of her boots clicking against the wet pavement. The air was thick with the scent of rain and coffee drifting from nearby cafes. The street was quiet except for the hum of early commuters, but Grace felt anything but calm. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her mind racing as she approached the courthouse steps. Today was supposed to be another ordinary day in her structured, predictable life. But nothing had felt predictable since she saw him again. Grace reached for her phone, hesitating before opening the last message she received the night before. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk. Marcus." Her ex-husband. Her heart pounded as she read the words again. The message felt like a fuse waiting to ignite something long buried. Marcus Bradley had always had a way of showing up when Grace least expected, or wanted, him to. The first time they crossed paths after the divorce had been 6 years ago in a grocery store, both of them pretending to have moved on. But last week, at a fundraiser for the Arts District, he appeared like a ghost of her past, dressed in an impeccable navy suit, his dark eyes catching hers across the room. Her husband, Andrew Thompson, hadn't noticed the moment, too busy discussing the renovation of a local museum wing. But Grace had felt Marcus's presence like static in the air. She had barely spoken to Marcus at the event. A few pleasantries, a tight smile, and yet, here she was, standing outside the courthouse, debating whether to meet him. Her phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Andrew. "Hey, where are you?" Andrew's voice was warm but distracted. Grace's pulse steadied as she smiled. "Just running errands." Andrew sighed. "Don't forget dinner tonight. I'm meeting the board members, and it'd mean a lot to have you there." "I'll be there," Grace assured him. "Good. I love you." "I love you too," Grace replied, the words automatic but hollow. As the call ended, Grace leaned against the cold stone wall of the building. She knew she should leave, walk away and bury the past where it belonged. But something about Marcus always pulled her back to moments she thought she had outgrown. Marcus was waiting for her at the corner cafe, seated at a table near the window with a coffee in hand. The moment Grace entered, their eyes met, and it was like time hadn't passed at all. "Grace," he said, standing as she approached. "Marcus." She forced a polite smile, though her hands trembled. They sat in silence for a few moments, the air between them thick with unspoken history. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Marcus admitted, his voice low and familiar. "Neither was I," Grace replied. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "There's something you need to know." Grace's breath caught. "Why now, Marcus?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I've made mistakes. And I think you have too." Her heart pounded as he spoke, the weight of old emotions mixing with new confusion. Later that day, Grace returned home to their elegant townhouse in Beacon Hill. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes from a life meticulously curated. Andrew's coat was neatly hung by the door, his briefcase resting where he always placed it. She moved through the rooms, her reflection trailing her in the polished mirrors, someone with the perfect life on the outside. But on the inside, the cracks had begun to show. When Andrew arrived home that evening, he greeted her with a kiss and a tired smile. "You look distracted." Grace forced a laugh. "Just a long day." Andrew nodded and poured them both a glass of wine. "The board dinner is tomorrow. I'm hoping we can make a good impression." Grace nodded along, though her mind was miles away. In a small cafe, sitting across from a man who had once known every part of her. The next morning, Grace sat at her desk at the publishing house where she worked as an editor. Manuscripts and notes lay scattered in front of her, but she couldn't focus. A new message appeared on her phone. "Tonight, after the dinner, meet me at the park. Marcus." Her heart thudded painfully. She knew she was standing at the edge of a decision that could change everything. That evening, Grace stood in front of the mirror in a navy blue cocktail dress, the diamond earrings Andrew had gifted her sparkling under the soft light. Andrew appeared behind her, adjusting his tie. "You look stunning," he said, resting his hands on her shoulders. Grace met his eyes in the reflection. "Thank you." Andrew smiled, unaware of the storm within her. "We're going to make a great impression tonight." Grace forced another smile, but the truth was heavy in her chest. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Grace's mind was already miles away, replaying Marcus's words. There's something you need to know. The night was only beginning, and Grace felt the weight of secrets pressing down on her like an unrelenting tide. The fundraiser was held in a grand hall downtown, the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the impeccably dressed guests. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air as Grace and Andrew walked through the doors. Andrew was immediately swept away by a group of board members, leaving Grace by the entrance. She took a moment to steady herself, smoothing the fabric of her dress and scanning the room. Her heart skipped when she saw Marcus at the far end of the hall, deep in conversation with an older man she recognized from local news features. Marcus hadn't noticed her yet, but Grace felt his presence like a live wire sparking across the room. Grace. She turned to see Allison West, her closest friend and a sharp observer of everything that went unsaid. Allison kissed Grace's cheek and handed her a flute of champagne. "I've been watching you since you walked in," Allison said with a knowing smirk. "What's going on?" Grace forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" Allison's eyes narrowed. "You've been somewhere else for days. And don't tell me it's just work stress." Grace hesitated, the truth catching in her throat. "It's complicated." Allison raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Instead, she linked her arm through Grace's and led her toward the art exhibit set up along the far wall. "Let's pretend life isn't messy for a while." Across the room, Marcus's eyes finally met Grace's. Time seemed to slow, the noise of the crowd dimming as their gazes locked. Allison, mid-sentence, followed Grace's line of sight and frowned. "Is that Marcus?" Allison's voice was cautious. Grace nodded, her heart pounding. Allison's grip on her arm tightened. "Tell me you're not thinking about—" "I don't know what I'm thinking," Grace confessed. Before Allison could respond, Andrew reappeared, a broad smile on his face. "I want you to meet someone." Grace turned, trying to compose herself as Andrew guided her toward an older couple involved in the museum's restoration. She nodded and smiled at all the right moments, but her mind drifted. Later in the evening, she stepped outside onto the balcony to get some air. The city stretched out before her, a canvas of lights and shadows. "You always did need an escape," Marcus's voice came from behind her. She closed her eyes for a moment before turning. "You shouldn't be here." Marcus stepped forward, his expression serious. "I wasn't going to come until I saw you." Grace's pulse raced. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can't pretend anymore," Marcus admitted. "You were never just a memory to me." Grace took a step back, the cool night air brushing against her bare shoulders. "It's been years, Marcus. And yet, here we are." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. When Grace returned to the ballroom, her cheeks were flushed, and her heart felt unsteady. Andrew was deep in conversation with a group of architects, his face animated and content. She watched him for a moment, a pang of guilt sharp in her chest. Andrew was dependable, steady, the kind of man who never let her feel adrift. But in Marcus's presence, she felt something else entirely, something wild and unmoored. Allison appeared at her side again, her expression soft. "You okay?" Grace nodded. "Just needed some air." Allison studied her for a long moment before changing the subject. "Let's grab another drink." That night, after the event ended and they returned home, Andrew poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the armchair in their study. "You were quiet tonight," he said, swirling the amber liquid. Grace busied herself with removing her earrings, avoiding his gaze. "It was a lot of people." Andrew nodded, his eyes lingering on her reflection in the mirror. "You seem distracted lately." Grace's hands froze for a moment before she resumed unpinning her hair. "Just tired." Andrew's brow furrowed. "If something's wrong, Grace, you can tell me." She met his gaze in the mirror, her heart aching. "Everything's fine." Andrew let out a slow breath and sipped his drink. "Okay." But as he leaned back, Grace knew that the distance between them was no longer something she could ignore. The next day, Grace sat in her office, staring at her inbox but unable to focus. A new message pinged on her phone. "Tonight, after the dinner, meet me at the park. Marcus." Her heart thudded painfully as she reread the message. By the time the sun began to set, Grace was standing at the edge of the park, the cool breeze tugging at her coat. Marcus was already there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said. Grace nodded, unable to speak. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her breath caught as she stepped closer. "What is it?" Marcus's eyes searched hers. "I never wanted to let you go." The weight of his confession settled over her, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fall away. The night air was still as Grace and Marcus sat together on a weathered park bench under the dim glow of the lamppost. The city around them hummed, but for Grace, the world had narrowed to Marcus's steady gaze. "You can't say things like that," Grace whispered, hugging her coat tighter around her. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I never got over it. Over us." Grace's throat tightened. "You were the one who ended things." Marcus's face twisted with regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then, but seeing you again," he trailed off, his eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken apologies. Tears stung the corners of Grace's eyes as memories surged back. Late nights in their old apartment, arguments that always felt too final, and the quiet ache that had lingered long after their divorce. "I have a life now," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "A husband. Responsibilities." Marcus reached out, his hand brushing hers. "But is it the life you wanted?" Grace pulled her hand away, the contact burning like an exposed truth. "I don't know." The following morning, the weight of the meeting with Marcus clung to Grace as she sipped her coffee at the breakfast table. Andrew was already up, reading the newspaper and jotting notes in the margins, a habit she found endearing once. "You've been quiet," Andrew noted without looking up. Grace forced a smile. "Just tired." Andrew set the paper down, his brow furrowed. "You've been saying that a lot lately." The words hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Grace wanted to tell him everything, to release the tangled truth that gnawed at her. But the fear of losing him held her back. Days passed, but the echoes of Marcus's confession followed Grace everywhere. The tension in her marriage grew, subtle but undeniable. Andrew, ever perceptive, began asking more questions. "Do you want to go away for the weekend?" Andrew asked one evening as they prepared dinner together. "Somewhere quiet, just the two of us." Grace hesitated, her heart torn between guilt and longing. "That sounds nice." Andrew smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. We need this." But life had its way of unraveling the most carefully laid plans. A week later, as Grace was leaving the publishing house late in the evening, she noticed a familiar silhouette standing near her car. "Marcus." She froze, glancing around the nearly deserted parking lot. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, approaching cautiously. "I needed to see you," Marcus said, his voice low. "Just to talk." Grace's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "This isn't a good idea." Marcus took a step closer. "It's never been a good idea. But that didn't stop us before." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as Marcus's presence stirred everything she had tried to suppress. "I can't do this," she whispered. Marcus's voice cracked. "Do you love him?" Grace's breath caught in her chest. "That's not fair." Marcus exhaled slowly, defeated. "Maybe not. But you deserve to be honest with yourself." She stepped back, shaking her head. "I need time." Marcus nodded reluctantly. "Take all the time you need." Grace drove home in silence, her mind spinning. When she walked into the house, the lights were dim, and Andrew was sitting in the living room, his laptop open. "Long day?" Andrew asked, glancing up. Grace nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah." Andrew closed his laptop and studied her. "You've been distant." Grace felt the words building in her chest, threatening to spill over. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Andrew stood, his expression softening. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. "I hope so." The weekend trip Andrew had planned came and went, filled with quiet dinners and long walks along the coast. Grace tried to lose herself in the simplicity of the moments they shared, but the shadow of Marcus lingered. One evening, Andrew handed Grace a glass of wine and said, "I've been thinking, maybe we should start a family." Grace's breath hitched. The suggestion was so earnest, so full of hope. I don't know if I'm ready," she said carefully. Andrew's face fell, though he quickly masked his disappointment. "Okay." The silence that followed was deafening. Back in the city, Marcus's name appeared on Grace's phone once more. "Meet me tonight. The rooftop where we used to go." Grace stared at the message, her heart heavy with indecision. The rooftop had been their place, a sanctuary where they'd shared dreams and fears under the stars. She knew what it meant to meet him there. That night, Grace stood at the edge of the rooftop garden, the city lights stretching endlessly below her. The wind tugged at her hair as Marcus stepped beside her. "I didn't think you'd come," Marcus said quietly. Grace turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "Neither did I." Marcus reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. The stars above bore witness to the moment as Grace let herself fall into the familiar, dangerous pull of the past. The morning after their meeting on the rooftop, Grace woke with the weight of her decisions pressing down on her chest. The city outside her window was bright and alive, but she felt as if she were standing in the shadows of her own life. Andrew was already awake, dressed in his tailored suit, sipping coffee as he read his morning emails at the kitchen table. The hum of his routine was almost comforting, but today, it felt stifling. "Morning," he said, looking up with a soft smile. "Morning," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew noticed her pale face and furrowed brow. He reached for her hand. "You okay?" She hesitated, then forced a nod. "Just didn't sleep well." Andrew squeezed her hand. "We'll have an early night tonight. I know things have felt off between us, but we'll get through this." Grace's heart ached at his sincerity. She didn't deserve his kindness, and she knew it. Later that day, Grace sat at her desk at the publishing house, staring at her phone. Marcus's number glowed on the screen. She was about to delete his messages when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Andrew." "Hey," she answered. Andrew's voice was calm but serious. "Grace, can you come home early? I have something important I need to talk to you about." Her stomach twisted. "Of course. I'll leave soon." The line went dead, and Grace sat frozen for a moment. She sensed that something was about to unravel. When Grace walked into their townhouse, Andrew was standing in the living room, his expression unreadable. On the coffee table lay a manila envelope. "What's this?" Grace asked cautiously. Andrew crossed his arms. "I hired a private investigator." Grace's heart dropped, her vision blurring for a moment. "What?" Andrew's voice cracked as he spoke. "I didn't want to believe it, but I've seen the photos, Grace." She stumbled forward, reaching for the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were pictures of her and Marcus, on the park bench at the rooftop garden, their hands intertwined under the night sky. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at Andrew. "I'm so sorry." Andrew's face twisted with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "Why, Grace? Why him?" Grace's voice trembled. "I don't know. I was lost, and he made me feel like the person I used to be." Andrew stepped back as if her words were a physical blow. "The person you used to be? What about us? What about the life we built?" "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, "but I did, and I hate myself for it." Andrew's eyes darkened as he paced the room, the anger he'd tried to contain bubbling over. "I loved you, Grace. I gave you everything." She sobbed openly now. "I know." Andrew stopped suddenly and turned to her, his expression hardening. "I'm not the kind of man who lets something like this go." Grace wiped her tears, fear prickling at the edges of her mind. "What do you mean?" Andrew's voice was cold. "You'll see." The next few days passed in a blur. Andrew was distant but composed, speaking to her only when necessary. Grace felt trapped in their shared home, the weight of his silence crushing her. Then one evening, Andrew came home with a calm but unnerving smile. "We're hosting a dinner," he said. Grace blinked, confused. "What?" "A dinner party. Just close friends." "I think it's time we remind everyone who we are," Andrew replied smoothly. Grace's heart sank. Andrew. It's already planned, he interrupted, his smile never wavering. It's important. Grace nodded reluctantly, unsure of his true intentions. The night of the dinner party arrived, and their home was filled with the warm glow of candles and the scent of roasted rosemary chicken. Friends laughed and mingled, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of tension beneath the polished facade. Grace moved through the crowd in a daze, her smile brittle. Allison pulled her aside near the hallway. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Grace shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "No, everything's falling apart." Before Allison could press further, Andrew called for a toast. "To Grace," he said, raising his glass. "The woman who has stood by my side through everything." The guests clapped, oblivious to the bitterness laced in his words. Grace forced a smile as the room blurred around her. Andrew's calculated cruelty was subtle but suffocating. After the last guest left, Andrew closed the door and turned to Grace. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice low. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You wanted to humiliate me." Andrew stepped closer, his expression dark. "I wanted you to feel a fraction of what you put me through." Grace's shoulders slumped under the weight of his words. "I don't know how we come back from this." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Maybe we don't." The silence that followed was filled with the finality of their unraveling. Andrew moved out the next morning, leaving behind a note on the kitchen counter. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Grace sat at the table, staring at the empty space where Andrew's coffee mug used to sit. The home they'd built together felt hollow, echoes of their life together lingering in every corner. She picked up her phone and hovered over Marcus's contact. But instead of calling, she deleted the number. It was time to face the consequences of her choices alone. In the weeks that followed, Grace stayed busy, working late hours, filling her weekends with projects, but the quiet moments were the hardest. Memories of Andrew's kindness and Marcus's passion haunted her. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was Andrew's. "Grace, I'm not writing to rekindle anything or reopen wounds. I just want you to know that despite everything, I did love you. Maybe I always will. I hope you find peace." Asterisk. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. For the first time in months, she took a deep breath and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd lost. The city outside her window kept moving forward, and Grace knew she had to do the same. The winter sun hung low over the Boston skyline as Grace walked along the Charles River, the frigid air biting at her cheeks. The river was half frozen, its surface shimmering under the pale light. The city moved around her, alive and indifferent, but she felt strangely at peace. A month had passed since Andrew had left, and for the first time in years, Grace was truly alone. The townhouse felt like an empty echo chamber of memories, but she had resisted the urge to escape. Instead, she had stayed, determined to rebuild herself piece by piece. One morning, Grace sat at her kitchen table, flipping through an old sketchbook she'd once kept in college. The pages were filled with half-finished drawings of streetscapes, hands, and eyes, small fragments of life she had noticed in fleeting moments. The doorbell rang, startling her from her reverie. When she opened the door, Allison stood there, bundled in a thick coat, holding 2 takeaway coffees. "I'm here to drag you out of this house," Allison declared, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Grace chuckled softly. "I appreciate the ambush." Allison set the coffees down and gave Grace a long, meaningful look. "You've been through hell, but you're still standing. That's something." Grace took a deep breath. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to," Allison said gently, "but you will." The days slowly began to fill with small routines that made Grace feel grounded. Early morning walks, evenings spent sketching again, and reconnecting with old friends. The silence of her home no longer felt suffocating, but rather like a blank page, waiting to be written on. One afternoon, as she wandered through the Boston Public Garden, a familiar voice called her name. "Grace." She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Marcus stood a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of the past settle between them. I've been spending more time outside lately. Marcus hesitated. How have you been? Grace's smile was small but genuine. Better. They stood in the quiet for a moment, the chill of the air wrapping around them. I've thought about reaching out, Marcus admitted, but I didn't know if it was what you wanted. Grace's eyes softened. I think it's time we both learned how to let go. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. You're right. Grace took a deep breath. Take care of yourself, Marcus. You too. He gave her a small, respectful nod before turning away. As he walked down the path, Grace felt no regret, only relief. The chapter with Marcus had closed, and she was finally ready to write a new one. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal. Grace signed up for an art class at a community center near Beacon Hill, rediscovering the joy of creating without pressure or deadlines. One evening, as she packed up her paints, the instructor approached her with a warm smile. Your work is beautiful. You have a gift. Grace smiled shyly. Thank you. It's been a long time since I painted seriously. Maybe it's time you started again, the instructor suggested. Grace nodded, feeling a flicker of excitement. Maybe it is. In early May, Grace received an unexpected email from Andrew. The subject line was simple. Checking in. She hesitated before opening it. Hi, Grace. I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about you and wanted to reach out, not to stir things up, but just to say that I'm doing okay. I hope you are too. Take care of yourself. Andrew. Grace closed her eyes for a moment before typing a short response. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for reaching out. I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I'm finding my way too. Take care. Grace. She hit send and exhaled, feeling lighter. That summer, Grace's paintings were displayed at a small neighborhood gallery's art show. She hadn't planned to participate, but Allison had submitted her work without telling her. When Grace walked into the gallery and saw her paintings on the wall, her breath caught. The canvases told a quiet story of resilience, loss, and hope. Allison appeared at her side, beaming. You did it. Grace laughed, tears in her eyes. You tricked me. You needed a push, Allison said with a grin. The gallery filled with warm conversations and appreciative glances at Grace's work. For the first time, she felt seen not as someone defined by her past, but by her strength. One evening, after the gallery closed, Grace stood alone in front of her favorite painting, a simple yet vibrant depiction of the Charles River at sunrise. The colors bled together in soft, hopeful hues. A man approached quietly. This one's my favorite, he said. Grace turned to see a man she didn't recognize, tall, with kind eyes and an easy smile. Mine too, she replied. He extended his hand. I'm Sam. I live nearby and couldn't resist stopping in. Grace shook his hand, feeling something warm and unexpected. Nice to meet you, Sam. They spoke for a while, their conversation light and effortless. As they said their goodbyes, Sam glanced back with a hopeful smile. Grace watched him walk away, her heart fluttering for the first time in what felt like forever. As she walked home that night, the city lights blurred like stars. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Life, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to let it shape her without defining her. And Grace was finally ready. End of story.